They came on a Monday morning in numbers that made the road itself seem to breathe. 300 motorcycles stretched along Route 76 outside Hollister, Missouri, their engines silent, their riders standing beside them in the pale early light with helmets held at their sides. No one spoke. The only sound was the October wind moving through what remained of the trees along the fence line and the distant call of a crow from somewhere in the flattened fields beyond, where a farmhouse had stood for 61 years. There was now a cleared foundation and the beginnings of a frame. Fresh lumber rose from the Missouri earth in clean, pale lines against the morning sky. The smell of sawdust and new wood drifted across the road. A woman stood at the edge of what used to be her front yard. 68 years old, 5 feet 4 inches. White hair pulled back. Wearing the same blue cardigan she had worn the Wednesday before, when the sky had turned the wrong color and everything she owned had stopped existing. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she looked at the 300 men who had come, and she did not look away. This is where the story ends. But to understand it, you have to go back 5 days. You have to go back to Wednesday afternoon and a sky the color of things that should not be. Nora Callum had lived in Hollister, Missouri for all 68 years of her life. She had been born in the county hospital 12 miles east, had gone to school in the same building that later became a feed store, had married Roy Callum at 22 in the Methodist church on Birch Street, and had never once felt the need to be anywhere else. She was not a woman who confused rootedness with smallness. She understood the difference between a life that was contained and a life that was complete, and hers had been the latter for a very long time. Roy had died 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind that does not announce itself until it has already made its decisions, and then moves with a speed that leaves the people left behind feeling like they were never given enough time to prepare, even when they knew it was coming. The medical bills had been considerable. The insurance had covered what insurance covers, which is to say, not enough. And what remained of their savings had gone to cover what the insurance did not. Nora had been a registered nurse for 30 years at the county hospital, and she understood medical billing in the way of someone who had sat on the other side of it for decades. And understanding it had not made it easier to absorb. She had kept the farm. There were people who told her she should not, that the sensible thing was to sell the land and move somewhere smaller and easier to maintain. And she had listened to all of them with the patient courtesy she extended to people who meant well and did not fully understand what they were suggesting. The farm was where Roy had planted the elm tree by the driveway the year they were married. It was where her son Danny had learned to ride a bicycle on the gravel path behind the barn, falling twice and getting up 3 times, because that was the kind of boy Danny had been. It was where Roy had poured the concrete floor of the storm cellar himself in the summer of 1974, working evenings after his regular job mixing by hand, because the rented mixer had broken down and he had refused to wait for a replacement. She remembered the evening he finished. He had come inside with cement dust on his forearms and the particular satisfaction on his face of a man who has completed something with his own hands that he believes will outlast him. He had washed up at the kitchen sink, and she had handed him a glass of iced tea. And he had said without particular drama, as if it were simply a fact he wanted her to have, Nora, whatever happens, you always have somewhere safe to go. She had thought about that sentence many times in the 9 years since he died. She thought about it on the Wednesday in question at 4:47 in the afternoon, when she stepped out onto the back porch and looked at the sky to the southwest and felt the specific quality of stillness that arrives before things become very bad. The color was wrong. It was the green that Nora had seen twice before in her life. The first time she was 11 years old, standing in her mother's kitchen, when her mother looked out the window and said, "Get to the cellar right now," without raising her voice, which was how Nora knew to run. The second time she was 39 and the tornado that followed had taken the roof off the Hendersons' barn 3/4 of a mile away and deposited it in pieces across 4 different fields. She knew what that color meant. She had known it for 57 years. The emergency alert on her phone had been going off for 20 minutes. The radio announcer had been using words like catastrophic and immediate and take shelter now in the clipped, breathless cadence of someone reading information they wish they were not reading. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado emergency, which is the classification above a tornado, warning the one they use when they mean it in the most serious possible way. Nora stood on her porch and looked at the sky and thought about Roy's cellar, and thought about the fact that she needed to get to it in the next few minutes. The wind was already picking up. The elm tree Roy had planted in the year of their marriage was moving in ways that elm trees should not move its branches, whipping in directions that contradicted each other. The whole tree disturbed by the invisible architecture of the storm approaching from the southwest. She had turned to go inside when she heard them. She heard them before she saw them, which is usually how it goes with motorcycles. The sound came from the direction of Route 76, low and continuous, the particular sound of many engines working together against something. She paused at the screen door and listened, and then she turned back toward the road. The headlights were visible through the trees at the edge of her property, many of them, moving slowly. Some of them weaving, all of them fighting against winds that had built in the last 10 minutes from unpleasant to dangerous. She squinted through the worsening light and saw them clearly enough. Motorcycles, dozens of them, pulled over to the shoulder or barely moving, their riders struggling to keep the bikes upright as the gusts came through in 30 and 40-mile-per-hour surges. They were going nowhere. The storm had caught them on the open road with nothing around them for a mile in any direction, except fields that offered no protection and Nora's farm. She stood at the edge of her porch and made the assessment that nurses make, which is a specific kind of assessment that does not have much room for feelings until the immediate situation has been evaluated. What she saw was this 70 or 80 people on the road exposed with a tornado emergency in effect, and an EF4 bearing down on this county. What she saw next confirmed the urgency. One of the bikes near the front of the group had gone down. The rider was on the road, and 2 others were crouching beside him in the wind, and even from this distance, she could see that he was not getting up under his own power. She went inside and got the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. She came back out and ran toward the road. She was 68 years old, and she ran toward 79 Hells Angels in the middle of a tornado emergency, because there was a man down on the asphalt, and Roy's cellar was 40 yards behind her, and the math was simple. She had done this kind of math for 30 years in the hospital. Person plus danger plus available solution equals action. The patch on their vests was the patch she had seen in photographs, the patch her son Danny had worn. She knew exactly who these men were, and it did not change the math by a single variable. She waved the flashlight in broad arcs over her head as she ran. The lead rider saw her. He was 50 or so, broad across the shoulders, with a gray beard visible where his bandana had shifted in the wind. He had pulled his bike to a stop at the edge of her driveway, and he was watching her approach with the particular expression of a man who is not sure what he is seeing. An old woman in a blue cardigan running toward him with a flashlight and a tornado warning was not something his experience had prepared him to categorize quickly. She stopped 10 feet from him. She had to raise her voice over the wind. "There is a storm cellar," she said, "under my barn. Reinforced concrete. You need to get your people off these bikes right now." The man lifted his visor. His eyes were light color gray or blue, the kind of eyes that have spent a great deal of time in outdoor light. He looked at her with a directness that she found easier to meet than the uncertain looks that people sometimes gave her when they were trying to decide whether to take her seriously. He said, "Do you know who we are?" It wasn't really a question. It was a test of a specific and well-practiced kind, and she had heard tests like it before, had heard them from patients who expected to be dismissed or ignored or treated as problems rather than people. She had learned a long time ago how to answer them. She said, "I know exactly who you are and that Tornado does not care about your patches. Now get your boys off those bikes before we all die out here." Something moved behind his eyes. She would think about it later, and she would decide it was recognition of a particular kind. The recognition of a person who has been surprised by directness when they expected evasion. He turned without another word and bellowed an order to the riders behind him, his voice somehow cutting through the howling wind with the practiced volume of a man accustomed to being heard over engine noise. "Everyone off. Leave the bikes. Follow her. Now." The next 4 minutes were controlled chaos in the way that emergencies can sometimes be, which is to say that they were frightening and fast and required everyone present to move without the benefit of full information. Men were dismounting and moving toward her driveway. She counted them as best she could while walking backward toward the barn. Some of them were helping the rider who had gone down, 2 men supporting him between them, his left arm hanging wrong at the elbow and his face tight with the kind of pain that does not permit much expression. She led them around the side of the barn to the cellar doors. The handles had rusted in the damp of the last year. And she said so out loud, and 3 men stepped forward immediately and took hold and pulled together. And the doors swung open on the concrete stairs descending into darkness. She positioned herself at the top of the stairs with her flashlight angled down to light the way, and she told them to go, and they went. She counted them as they passed. The injured man was carried down carefully by 2 of his brothers, his good hand gripping someone's shoulder. The wind was a physical pressure now, a pushing, insistent force that was making it difficult to stand upright. The sky above the fields to the southwest was a darkness within darkness, a concentration of weather that had become something with weight and intention. When she estimated 75 or so had gone down, she looked back toward the road. The lead rider was the last one left on the surface, confirming with his eyes that no one remained behind, scanning the driveway and the road shoulder with the methodical thoroughness of someone who does not leave until he is checked. He looked at her. She said, "That is everyone." He said, "That is everyone." She went down the stairs, and he followed and pulled the heavy doors shut above them, and the light disappeared, and there was only her flashlight beam and the sound of many people breathing in a concrete space and growing above them with a speed that compressed several seconds into something that felt like a single held breath. The sound of what was coming. Roy's cellar was 40 feet by 30 feet. It had concrete walls 8 inches thick that Roy had poured in sections over 6 evenings in the summer of 1974, working by the light of a trouble lamp hung from the barn floor above. The shelves along the walls held emergency supplies that Nora had maintained with the same systematic attention she had brought to everything since Roy died. Canned goods rotated regularly. Water jugs checked and replaced flashlights. Tested batteries fresh, a first aid kit that was considerably more comprehensive than what most people would consider necessary, because Nora had specific ideas about what constituted adequate preparation. The space was not designed to hold 79 people. It was holding 79 people. The lead rider had made his way through the press of bodies to stand near her. In the beam of her flashlight, she could read the patches on his vest more clearly. Hell's Angels, Missouri Chapter, President. She noted the injury first because she was a nurse, and injuries presented themselves to her attention before other information did. The man who had gone down on the road was sitting against the wall to her left, his left arm cradled against his body, at an angle that confirmed what she had suspected from the road. The elbow was wrong. Could be the radius, could be the ulna, could be both. The way he was sitting told her the ribs might also be involved. She crouched beside him. He was maybe 30 years old, with tattoos on his neck, and a face that was working very hard to hold a specific expression of stoicism that was costing him considerable effort. She said, "What is your name, sweetheart?" He blinked. The word sweetheart in that context was not what he had been expecting from any human being in any setting, and the unexpectedness of it seemed to briefly displace the pain. He said, "Cutter." She said, "Cutter, I am going to look at that arm. It is going to hurt, but I will be as quick as I can. You tell me if the pain changes quality. Do you understand what I mean by that?" He said he understood. She opened the first aid kit and went to work. Above them, the tornado arrived. There is no way to adequately describe what an EF4 tornado sounds like from inside a concrete cellar, directly beneath its path, because the sounds it makes are not sounds that human experience has generated adequate language for. It is not simply loud, although it is that. It is a pressure change as much as a sound, a physical alteration of the air that makes the ears do things ears do not normally do, that makes the chest feel like something is pressing against it from the outside. The concrete walls of Roy's cellar flexed. Dust came down from the ceiling in thin, continuous streams. The doors above them rattled with a violence that seemed impossible given their weight. Someone began to pray in a low, continuous murmur. Someone else was saying something that might have been a name, repeating it the way people repeat things they need to hold on to. Nora finished the splint on Cutter's arm. She had used materials from her kit and 2 pieces of flat aluminum she kept specifically because a splint sometimes required rigidity that standard materials could not provide. She checked the circulation at his fingers. Adequate. She checked his breathing, had him take as deep a breath as he could manage. His face told her what she needed to know about the ribs. She stood up. She raised her voice over the sound of what was happening above them, and she said, "Everyone listen to me." The cellar went as quiet as 79 frightened people can go. She said this cellar was built by my husband in 1974. He poured every inch of it himself. He built it because he wanted me to always have somewhere safe to go. In 49 years, nothing has touched it. Tonight will not be the first time. She paused for one beat. I need everyone to stay low and stay calm. We are going to be fine. The lead rider pushed through the crowd to stand beside her. He was not a man who pushed easily through anything. He moved with the particular solidity of someone who has learned that his physical presence has effects he needs to manage carefully. He stopped beside her and he looked at her in the way that people sometimes look at each other in extreme situations, which is to say with less performance and more reality than normal life permits. He said, I am Holt Greer. Most people call me Ironside. She said, Nora Callum. Most people call me Nora. He said, you didn't have to do this. She said, of course I did. What kind of person would I be otherwise? He looked at her for a moment. He said, most people see the patches and they lock their doors. She said, most people are operating on fear instead of information. Now, I have coffee in thermoses on the shelf behind you, and blankets in the bin beside them. It is going to be a long night, and there is nothing any of us can do about what is happening above us. Might as well be as comfortable as possible while we wait it out. She turned to check on Cutter, and she heard Holt begin organizing the distribution of the thermoses and blankets behind her. And she thought that whatever else he was a man who knew how to take a direction. The hours inside Roy's cellar had a quality that Nora would find difficult to describe afterward when people asked her about it, because the word she kept returning to was unexpected, which does not fully capture it. What was unexpected was not the situation, which was extreme, but comprehensible, but the texture of the time inside it. 79 men who had ridden into a natural disaster sat in a concrete room and drank coffee from Nora's thermoses and wrapped themselves in Nora's blankets. And they talked. Quietly at first, and then with increasing ease, the way people sometimes talk when the ordinary barriers of context have been removed by circumstances. She learned that they were on their annual charity run from St. Louis to Branson, a ride they did every October to raise money for veterans organizations, homeless shelters, and children's medical funds. She learned this from Holt, who told her without emphasis the way of someone stating a fact rather than making a case. She asked about Cutter. Someone said he was 29, had been riding for 8 years, was from a small town outside Jefferson City. He had a daughter who was 4 years old. The information was offered simply the way communities offer information about their members to people they are deciding to trust. She sat on an overturned supply crate and told them about Roy. She told them about the cellar, about the 6 evenings in 1974, about the trouble lamp and the hand mixing and the finished floor, and what Roy had said when it was done. She could feel the room listening. There is a specific quality to a group of people listening to something they recognize as true, and this room had it. Holt said he sounds like a man who thought ahead. She said he was. He always thought about what I would need after he was gone. He just did not know it would be this. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She had put the photograph there before the storm, in the way that she always put it somewhere close to her, on days when the world felt particularly uncertain. It was a photograph of Danny taken sometime in the 2 years before his last deployment. He was standing in front of a motorcycle she did not recognize, wearing his vest, grinning in the way he grinned when he was genuinely happy, rather than performing happiness for someone's benefit. He was 27 in the photograph. He looked like Roy around the jaw and like Nora around the eyes, which was the arrangement she had always found most pleasing. Behind Danny in the photograph, slightly out of focus but visible, was a large man with a gray beard. She held the photograph in the beam of her flashlight and looked at it. And then she looked across the cellar at Holt Greer. And she held the comparison in her mind for a moment before she spoke. She said, "Holt." He looked at her. She held the photograph toward him. She said, "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" He took it from her and angled it toward the light. His expression changed in a way that was visible even in the dim and uneven illumination of the cellar. It was not a large change. His face was not the kind of face that made large, visible changes. But something happened behind his eyes that had not been there before, a shift in the quality of his attention from general to specific. Before he could speak, a voice came from further back in the cellar. It was an older voice, rougher at the edges, the voice of a man who had been riding long roads for a very long time. The voice said, "That is Ghost." Not a question, a statement. The absolute certainty of recognition. The cellar went quiet. A man worked his way forward from the back. He was in his 60s, white-bearded, with a face that looked like it had been exposed to weather for most of its existence. He stopped in front of Nora and he looked at the photograph. And then he looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once, all of them large. He said, "Your son was Ghost. Danny Callum." Missouri, Chapter 2, 2003 to 2007. Nora said yes. The man looked at Holt. Holt was still looking at the photograph. He turned it over and then turned it back. He looked at Nora with the particular expression of someone who is processing information that has arrived from an unexpected direction and needs a moment to understand what it means. He said, "Your son was one of ours." She said, "For 4 years. Before Iraq." The cellar stayed quiet. Holt said, "He talked about you. He talked about this farm. He talked about his father building the storm cellar." Nora looked at him. She said, "He talked about all of you too. He said you were the best men he knew." He said it more than once. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. It was the silence of a room full of people absorbing something that has rearranged the context of everything around them. Above, the tornado continued its passage over Hollister, Missouri, its sound enormous and indifferent. Below, in Roy's concrete cellar, 79 men sat with the new knowledge of who they were sitting with. Holt handed the photograph back to Nora. He said, "How long ago?" She said, 2007, his second tour. He was 29 years old. Holt said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I was at the service." Nora looked at him. She said, "I didn't see you there." He said, "We were outside. We did not want to intrude on the family. There was not much family left by then, and we did not know if we would be welcome." She thought about that. She thought about a service she had attended mostly alone, except for a few people from the church and 2 of Danny's friends from before he joined the military. She thought about standing at the grave in October 2007, which was the same month as this October, the same quality of autumn light. and she thought about what it would have meant if she had known that men who had ridden with her son were standing outside the cemetery fence. She said you would have been welcome. He said, I know that now. Above them, the tornado continued its work. The cellar held. Roy's concrete held as it had always held as he had built it, specifically to hold in the summer of 1974, by the light of a trouble lamp one section at a time, because he was the kind of man who thought carefully about what the people he loved would need when he was no longer there to provide it. After the wind had peaked and then begun to diminish, after the pressure had changed back towards something like normal and the dust from the ceiling had settled after the prayers had concluded, and the coffee thermoses had been emptied, and the conversation had found its way through the strange territory of that night and arrived somewhere quieter, Holt. Greer stood up from where he had been sitting and said he was going to check the doors. He climbed the stairs. He pushed the doors open a few inches and looked through the gap at what the night had left behind. He looked for several seconds. Then he pulled the doors back to where they had been, and he turned on the stairs, and he looked down at the cellar full of people, and he looked at Nora, who was watching him from the bottom of the stairs, with the patient attention of a woman who has already understood something from the quality of his pause. He said, the sky is clearing. The storm has passed. He did not say anything else yet. Nora said all right. She stood up and she climbed the stairs. He held the door open for her, which was both a courtesy and a deliberate act, because he stood on her left side, which meant that as she came through the doors, she would naturally turn right, first away from the direction of the farmhouse. He was trying to give her one more second. She turned left. She stopped. The farmhouse was not there. What was there was the foundation, and around it, in every direction, the distributed evidence of what had been inside the house, which was now spread across several acres, in pieces too small and too mixed with other debris to be identifiable as individual objects. The porch where she had stood 3 hours ago, watching the horizon, was not there. The kitchen where she had made coffee every morning for 40 years was not there. The bedroom where Roy had died in the bed they had shared for 4 decades was not there. The window of Danny's childhood room, the one he had looked out of every morning for 17 years, was not there. The elm tree Roy had planted in the year of their marriage was not there. She stood and looked at it for a long time. The sky to the east was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of dawn. The air smelled of damp earth and broken wood, and the particular ozone quality that violent weather leaves behind. Somewhere in the fields to the north, a bird had started making a sound which seemed under the circumstances both inappropriate and deeply ordinary. Behind her, she could hear the bikers coming up out of the cellar in ones and twos, emerging into the gray pre-dawn and going quiet as they took in what the storm had done. Holt came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, which was the right thing to do. After a while, Nora said, "Well, I never liked that kitchen anyway." Holt turned to look at her. The absurdity of it hit them both at almost the same moment, the specific and precise absurdity of a woman surveying the complete destruction of her home and making a joke about the kitchen. And it was funny in the way that certain true things are funny not because they are light, but because they contain the whole weight of things without collapsing under it. Holt started to laugh, and once he started, he could not stop for a moment. And when he finally got himself back under control, he was looking at Nora Callum with an expression that was part admiration and part something harder to name, something closer to recognition, as if he had just identified a quality in her that he had encountered before, in specific and rare circumstances. He said, "You just lost everything." She said, "I did not lose everything." She turned to look at the bikers standing in her yard. The 79 men who had come out of Roy's cellar and were standing in the gray early morning alive, all of them without a single one missing from the count she had kept in her head. I lost a house. Everyone who went into that cellar came out of it. That is the only number that matters this morning. Holt looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to his brothers and he called them together. He told them clearly and without embellishment what the situation was. This woman, he said, had opened her shelter to them when they had no other option. This woman had treated their injured brother in the dark during an EF4 tornado. And this woman, he said, and here his voice changed quality slightly, was the mother of Danny Callum. Ghost. Missouri Chapter. 2003 to 2007. The silence that followed was different from all the silences of the night before it. Holt said, "We are Hell's Angels. We do not forget what we owe. And we owe this woman everything." He looked at Nora. He said, "Nora, do you have somewhere to stay? Family we can contact." She said, "My sister Marvel is in Springfield. She has been trying to get me to move in with her for years." He said, "You are going to need to go to her for now. But I want you to know something before you do." He took a step toward her and he said it in the direct way he said most things, without preamble or softening. He said, 5 days. Give us 5 days and then look toward this road." She looked at the empty lot where her house had stood. She said, "Look where?" "Through what window?" He said, "Trust me." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Danny. She thought about what Danny had said in one of his last letters before the second tour, when she had asked him what the club was actually like, the real version, not the version from the news. Danny had written back a paragraph she had read many times since. He had written that the thing about the club that people on the outside did not understand was that when one of them needed something, it was simply done. No discussion of whether it was convenient. No negotiation about terms. When a brother needed something, you did it because that was what it meant to be a brother. She looked at Holt Greer in the gray dawn of a morning that had taken her kitchen and her porch and the elm tree Roy had planted, and everything she owned except the cardigan she was wearing and the photograph in its pocket. She said, 5 days. He nodded. Over the next hour, the bikers did what they could with what time they had. They cleared debris from the areas of the yard that were passable. They located what possessions could be located in the wreckage that surrounded the foundation and gathered them carefully. Someone found her coffee maker, which was unrecognizable. Someone found Roy's old pocket watch miraculously intact, which Nora put in the same pocket as the photograph. Someone found one boot from a pair she had owned for 11 years without finding its companion. Cutter sat on the running board of a truck someone had driven in from down the road, his splinted arm across his chest, watching the recovery operation with the alert eyes of someone who is in pain but paying attention. Before he mounted his bike, Holt took out his phone and photographed Nora standing in front of the cleared foundation. She was small in the frame. The morning light was still gray and thin. The destruction around her was visible in the background. Her expression was not the expression of a devastated woman. which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the photograph. She looked like someone who had been through something and had come to the other side of it without losing the essential quality that had taken her there in the first place. He said, "I'm going to share this with our network. Every chapter. Every brother who can see a screen." She said, "You will make me famous." He said, "You deserve to be." She said, "I will settle for the 5 days." He smiled. It was the second time she had seen him smile, and the quality of it was the same as the first genuine arrived at. Without effort, the smile of someone who does not distribute them without reason. He said, "5 days, Nora. Look toward the road." The 79 motorcycles of the Hells Angels fired up their engines one at a time, the sound building from individual notes into a chord, and then into something larger than a chord. A collective expression of mechanical life that filled the empty morning air of Hollister, Missouri, and then moved down Route 76 and diminished, and was gone. Nora stood alone on the concrete of Roy's storm cellar, which was all that remained of everything he had built, and she listened until the last engine had faded beyond the range of hearing. Then Marvel's car turned into the driveway because Nora had called her during the last hour, and Marvel got out and looked at what was left and put her hand over her mouth, and Nora walked to her and accepted the embrace with the practical patience of someone who understands that the people who love you need to express it in their own way and at their own pace. They stood together in front of the foundation of Roy's house in the full October morning light. The elm tree was gone. The kitchen was gone. 40 years of accumulation of objects that had outlived their original purposes and become instead containers for memory. All of it was gone. What remained was a concrete floor 16 inches below grade that an EF4 tornado had passed directly over and had not touched. Roy had built it for her. It had done what he built it to do. She thought he knew. He always thought about what I would need. She picked up the bag Marvel had brought for her without being asked because Marvel had always been practical in a crisis, even when she was not practical in ordinary circumstances. And she walked to Marvel's car, and she got in and they drove towards Springfield. Behind them, Hollister began the process of counting its losses and beginning in the slow and difficult way of small communities to think about what came next. Nora looked out the passenger window at the Missouri landscape moving past at the fields and the fence lines and the occasional farmstead that the storm had passed around rather than through at the ordinary persistence of the countryside that continued regardless. She held Roy's pocket watch in one hand and Danny's photograph in the other. She thought about 5 days. She thought about what Holt Greer had said, and she thought about what Danny had written about brotherhood, about the thing that people on the outside did not understand about the way that when something needed to be done, it was simply done. The road to Springfield was long and flat, and the sky above it was the blue that comes after bad weather has cleared sharp and clean and very high, the kind of blue that seems to go further than the ordinary sky. Nora looked at it. She thought, 5 days. Marvel's house in Springfield smelled of lavender and fabric softener, and the particular indoor warmth of a home that has been maintained with consistent attention for many years. It was a good house. Clean lines, sensible furniture, a kitchen that worked properly, a guest room with curtains that matched the bedspread in the way of someone who had thought carefully about how the room should feel to a person sleeping in it. Nora lay awake in that room on the first night and looked at the ceiling and thought about Roy's pocket watch on the nightstand and the photograph of Danny propped against the lamp. And she thought about the concrete floor of the cellar, 16 inches below grade in Hollister, which was still there while everything above it was not. She had been a nurse for 30 years. She understood the mechanics of shock, the way the body and mind manage extraordinary events by distributing the processing across time, rather than receiving it all at once. She understood that what she was feeling in the first 48 hours was not the full weight of what had happened, that the full weight would arrive in stages over days and weeks, and that some of it would arrive at inconvenient moments in grocery stores and in the middle of ordinary conversations when something small and specific triggered the memory of something large that was now gone. She was not afraid of this process. She had watched it in other people for 3 decades. She simply noted it the same way she noted the quality of the ceiling above the guest bed as a fact of the current situation. What she could not do was sleep. Marvell had done everything correctly. She had made tea and then dinner, and then offered a bath, and then shown Nora the guest room with the careful attention of someone who wants very badly to help and knows that most forms of helping are not what is actually needed. She had also said over dinner with the gentleness of someone who has been building toward a suggestion for several years and sees in the current catastrophe an opening. Nora, you could just stay. Permanently. You don't have to go back. Nora had looked at her sister across the dinner table and had understood that Marvel meant this kindly, that it came from a genuine place of wanting her sister nearby and safe, and not alone in a farmhouse with a leaking roof and intermittent electricity. She understood all of that, and she had said with equal gentleness, I need to think. What she was thinking about in the guest room ceiling hour of 2 in the morning was the hob of the old kitchen stove that had run slightly hot on the left side for the last 3 years, which had required adjusting every recipe that used that burner. She was thinking about the specific creak of the 3rd step from the bottom of the main staircase, which she had navigated in the dark so many times that her body knew to shift her weight to the right to avoid it. She was thinking about the window in Danny's childhood room that had stuck in humid weather since the summer of 1991, and the particular technique required to open it, which involved lifting slightly while turning the latch, a thing that Danny had figured out at age 13 and had been quietly proud of knowing. None of these things existed anymore. On the second morning, Marvell made breakfast and they sat at the kitchen table, and Marvel watched Nora with the careful lateral attention of someone who is monitoring a situation without wanting to appear to monitor it. Nora ate and drank her coffee and looked out the window at Marvel's backyard, which had a garden that was ending for the season. The last of the tomatoes gone to frost the beds, put away in the particular neatness of a gardener who plans ahead. The doorbell rang at 9:45. Marvell answered it and came back to the kitchen with the slightly compressed expression of someone who has encountered something on their doorstep that they were not expecting and are not entirely sure how to introduce. She said, there is a man from an insurance company. His name was Royce Bundren. He was in his mid-40s, which put him at an age that Nora associated with the particular kind of professional confidence that has not yet been tested by enough genuine difficulty. He wore a dark suit that was well pressed and shoes that had been recently polished, and he carried a briefcase with the practiced ease of a man for whom the briefcase was as natural as the suit, both of them components of a presentation that had been assembled over years to communicate a specific set of things about him. He sat across from Nora at Marvel's kitchen table And he opened the briefcase, and he laid out his documentation with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this many times. He said he was very sorry for her loss. He said it in the tone of a man who says this sentence multiple times a week, and has therefore developed a version of it that sounds sufficiently sincere without requiring him to actually feel the content of it, which would be unsustainable at the volume his job required. He said, "Mrs. Callum, I have been assigned to your claim, and I have completed my initial assessment of the property." He paused, which was a practiced pause, the kind that signals incoming information of a specific quality. "I want to be straightforward with you about what our assessment has found." Nora said, "Please be straightforward." He said the primary structure showed evidence of deterioration predating the weather event. Specifically, the roof had lost significant shingle coverage, consistent with a period of deferred maintenance. The electrical system showed indications of age-related degradation. These factors are relevant to our coverage calculation under Section 14 of your policy, which addresses the distinction between storm damage and pre-existing structural deficiency. He said it the way the language of insurance is designed to be said, which is smoothly and without emphasis on any particular word, so that the meaning arrives at the listener already distributed evenly across many syllables, making it difficult to locate the specific point where the problem lives. Nora looked at him. She said, "My roof lost shingles because I could not afford to replace them after my husband's medical bills. My electrical system is old because the house was built in 1962, and I have maintained it within my means. The tornado was an EF4. It destroyed 300 homes in this county. Are you telling me that my coverage is being reduced because my house was old before the tornado made it no longer exist?" Royce Bundren looked at his documentation. He said your policy provides coverage for sudden weather events, but the calculation of that coverage takes into account the pre-event condition of the structure. After applying the relevant adjustments, our assessment of your covered loss is. He said a number. The number was not nothing. It was also not enough to build a house. It was not enough to buy a plot of land. It was in the precise analysis that Nora conducted in the approximately 4 seconds between hearing the number and responding to it enough to purchase a reliable used car, and perhaps 6 months of modest rent somewhere. She had paid premiums on that policy for 31 years. She looked at the number on the form in front of her. She did not make a sound. She picked up the form and she read the relevant sections. She read them the way she had read patient charts for 30 years, which was carefully and completely, and without skipping the parts that were written to be skipped. When she was done, she set the form back on the table. She said, "I need time to consider this." Royce Bundren said, "Of course." He began gathering his materials with the practiced efficiency of a man completing a transaction. "I should mention that your policy contains a dispute resolution window. You have until Monday at 9 a.m. to either accept the settlement or file a formal objection. After that point, the settlement offer is withdrawn, and you would need to pursue any disagreement through the standard litigation process, which can take." She said, "I understand the timeline." He said, "Wonderful." He closed the briefcase. "Again, I am very sorry for your situation, Mrs. Callum." He stood up. "Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions before Monday." He left. Marvel had been standing in the doorway of the kitchen for the last portion of that conversation. After the front door closed, she came back to the table and sat down and looked at Nora. She said, "Nora, that number, Nora said, I know. Marvel said, maybe you should just accept it. It's something. And you could stay here and we could figure out. Nora said, Marvell. Marvel waited. Nora said, Roy built that cellar with his own hands. He built it on that land. He built it so I would always have somewhere safe to go. That land is where he is buried in the cemetery on Birch Road 6 miles from that cellar. That land is where Danny grew up and where Danny came back to when he came back. I am not signing a form that gives it up for the price of a used car. I am simply not gonna do that. Marvell looked at her sister. She had known Nora for 66 of her 68 years, which was long enough to know the specific quality of the statement she had just heard. It was not the quality of a position that was open to discussion. It was the quality of a fact. She said, all right. She got up and made more coffee. Nora sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the garden that was ending for the season. And she thought about Monday at 9 a.m. and about the number on Roy Spundren's form, and about Roy's cellar, and about 5 days. She put her hand in her cardigan pocket and felt the edge of Danny's photograph and Roy's pocket watch. And she sat with what she was carrying for a while, the way you sit with something when you have decided that moving is not yet the right action, and patience is what the moment requires. On Thursday morning, she called the insurance company and told them she had not made a decision yet. On Friday, she called again and said the same thing. She spent the days in Marvell's guest room reading. She had not brought books because there had not been time to bring anything except what was in her pockets. But Marvell had a full bookshelf in the hallway, and Nora selected things from it, without much consideration, reading whatever her hand landed on because what she needed from the reading was not content, but occupation the way a long car trip needs the radio, not for the music, but for the sound. She read Danny's last letter every morning. She had kept it in her wallet for 16 years, the wallet that had been in her cardigan pocket on Wednesday, and was therefore among the things that had survived. The letter was on paper so frequently folded and unfolded that the creases had worn nearly through. She had not needed to unfold it in years because she had long since memorized every word. She unfolded it and read it anyway because there was something about the physical act of reading his handwriting that was different from the act of recalling it. The letter said, Mom, don't worry about me over here. I've got good brothers watching my back, and I know you know what that means. I think about the farm all the time. I think about Dad's cellar and the elm tree and the way the fields look in October when the light gets that angle. I'll be back before you know it. Tell the farm I said hello. He had not been back. She folded the letter along its ancient creases and put it back in her wallet and sat with the October light coming through Marvel's guest room window, which had a different angle than the light at the farm, which had a different angle than the light anywhere else she had ever lived. Saturday came gray and damp. She was at Marvell's kitchen table with her second coffee of the morning when her phone rang. The number was not one she had saved, but the Missouri area code was familiar, and she answered. The voice on the other end was Holt Greer's. She recognized it immediately. The particular register of it lower than most, with the unhurried quality of a man who does not experience silence as something that needs to be filled. He said, Nora. She said, Holt. He said, we have been back at the property this morning, searching the debris. Our brothers have been working the site since first light. She said, I told you that you didn't have to. He said, "I know what you told us." He paused. "Nora, we found something." She waited. He said there was a tin box. Small, with the letters CF on the lid. "Do you know what I am describing?" She was very still. She said, "Roy bought that box in 1968, before we were married. He kept papers in it, important ones. Holt said it was in the debris from the east end of the structure, near what I think was the bedroom area." She said yes. "I kept it on the shelf above the bureau." He said the box is intact. The contents are intact. She said, "What is in it?" He said there are a few documents that look like property records and insurance papers from a long time ago. And there is an envelope. "Nora, the envelope is addressed to Ned Calloway, our chapter president from 2001 to 2009. She said nothing. He said it is in Danny's handwriting. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Marvell's neighbor was doing something in their yard, a regular rhythmic sound of some kind of outdoor work. The ordinary persistence of Saturday morning. She said it has never been opened. He said no. The seal is intact. She said Danny put it there. Before his second tour, he came home for 2 weeks in March of 2007 before he went back. He put it in Roy's box. He asked me to keep it safe. He said it was something for the club, a letter for the chapter. He said if anyone from the club ever asked for it to give it to them." She stopped. No one ever asked. Holt was quiet on his end. She said Ned Calloway died in 2009. Holt said yes. There was an accident on I-44 in November of that year. He was killed. He paused. "We have a chapter archivist who keeps records. When I described the envelope, he told me that Danny had spoken to Ned before his second deployment. He had asked Ned to come to the farm and collect a letter if Danny did not come back. He said Ned planned to go. He was going to make the trip in December of 2009. He never made it. The silence between them had a specific quality, the quality of information that has been separated from the people who needed it for 16 years finally arriving at the place it was always supposed to reach." She said, "Open it." He said, "Are you certain? We can bring it to you without." She said, "Holt, open it and read it to me." She heard the sound of paper, the careful, specific sound of an old envelope being opened by hands that understood what they were handling. She heard him begin to read. Danny's voice was in it. That was the only way she knew how to describe what she experienced in the next several minutes sitting at Marvel's kitchen table on a gray Saturday morning. The words were not Danny's speaking voice exactly because letters are not voices, but they had the rhythm of how he had thought, and the particular shape of how he had organized things in reading them aloud. Holt's voice carried the structure of Danny's meaning, even though the sound was different. The letter said that Danny had something he needed to ask of the chapter, and that he was putting it in writing because he had always been better at writing than talking about things that mattered to him. Which was true. Nora thought it had always been true. The letter said that his mother was alone on the farm, and that she was the kind of person who did not ask for help, even when she needed it. Which was also true, and that he worried about her more than he worried about most things. Which was saying something given where he was going. The letter said that he was asking the chapter formally and with full understanding of what he was asking to check on his mother. Not immediately. Not in a way that would alarm her, but in the way that brothers checked on people they had made a commitment to. He said he trusted the chapter with this more than he trusted anyone else because he had seen how they kept their commitments, and he needed someone to keep this one. The letter said she won't tell you she needs anything. She will tell you she is fine even when she is not, because that is who she is. So don't ask her. Just show up. That is all I am asking. Just show up and keep showing up. She deserves that. She has always deserved that. The letter was signed Danny, Ghost. Your brother always. Holt stopped reading. The sound of Marvell's neighbor doing something in the yard continued at its regular rhythm. The coffee in Nora's cup had gone cold. She said he wrote that in March of 2007. Holt said yes. She said, and he went back to Iraq in April. Holt said yes. She said, and he did not come home. Holt said no. She said, and Ned was gonna come for the letter. In December. Holt said yes. And he died in November. She said, and the letter stayed in Roy's box. Holt said, for 16 years. She sat with that. She sat with the mathematics of it, the specific and precise sequence of events that had placed a letter written for one purpose and one recipient in a tin box on a shelf above a bureau for 16 years until a tornado had taken the bureau, and the shelf and the house around them, and buried the box in the debris where the men who had come to help her had found it on a Saturday morning because they were the kind of men who looked until they found what they were looking for. She said, Holt. He said yes. She said he knew. He knew even before he went back that he might not come home. And the first thing he thought about was making sure someone would look after me. Holt said yes. She said I would not have guessed that. She stopped. That is not right. Of course I would have guessed that. That is exactly who Danny was. She heard Holt's breathing on the line, steady and slow. She said, I am not going to sign Royce Bundren's form. He said, good. She said he gave me until Monday at 9 a.m. He said, I remember. 5 days, Nora. I told you 5 days. He paused. Monday morning. Look toward the road. She looked out Marvell's kitchen window at the gray October Saturday. The neighbor's yard work had stopped. Somewhere down the street a car was backing out of a driveway, the ordinary suburban mechanics of a weekend morning. She said, Holt, how many are coming? He said, as many as can ride. She said, you have been doing this since Wednesday night. He said, we have been doing this since we read what Danny wrote. He paused. He asked us to show up. We are going to show up. She said, you understand that the house is gone. There is nothing to show up to. He said there is a concrete floor that your husband poured in 1974 that is still there. That is enough to start with. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, Roy would have liked you. Holt said, I think I would have liked Roy. She said goodbye, and she put the phone down on Marvell's kitchen table, and she looked at it for a while. Marvell appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the quality of the silence that had followed the conversation. She looked at Nora, and then at the phone, and then at Nora again. Nora said, Marvell, I need you to drive me back to Hollister on Monday morning. Marvell said Nora. Nora said, I know, but I need you to take me back on Monday morning, before 9 o'clock. Marvell looked at her sister for a long moment. She was 2 years younger than Nora, and had spent most of those 2 years following 2 years behind Nora. In the sense that mattered, which was not age, but the specific quality of certainty that Nora had carried through her life like a tool she had learned to use very young and had never put down. She said, all right. Monday morning. Nora nodded. She picked up Danny's letter from the table, the one from her wallet, and she unfolded it along its worn creases. And she read it again, even though she did not need to read it, because there was something about reading his handwriting that was different from recalling it. Tell the farm I said hello. She put the letter back in her wallet. She went to the guest room and she sat on the edge of the bed, with Roy's pocket watch in one hand, and she wound it, the way she wound it every evening, which was a habit she had maintained since the day Roy bought it. 39 years of winding a pocket watch on behalf of a man who no longer needed it. Wound because the watch was still measuring time, even if Roy was not there to read it, and that seemed like a thing that deserved to continue. She thought about Monday. She thought about Roy Spundren and his briefcase, and his Section 14 and his Monday deadline, and the number he had written on the form. And she thought about what Roy had said when he finished the Cellar in 1974, which was Nora. Whatever happens, you always have somewhere safe to go. The Cellar was still there. The land was still there. Whatever Roy Spundren's form said about pre-existing structural deficiency, whatever adjustments his calculations had made, whatever the number at the bottom of his assessment represented in the formal language of insurance coverage, none of it changed the fact that the land under what used to be her kitchen was the same land that Roy had farmed and Danny had grown up on, and that she had lived her entire life within 12 miles of. None of it changed what that land was. She was not going to sign a form that said otherwise. Outside Marvell's guest room window, the Saturday afternoon was getting darker, the gray deepening toward evening in the particular way of October days that have stayed gray from morning and intend to stay gray until they become night. A light came on in the house across the street. Somewhere a dog was making the sound of a dog that has been left outside longer than it expected and would like this to be acknowledged. Nora put Roy's pocket watch on the nightstand, and she lay down on top of the bedspread with her cardigan on, and she looked at the ceiling of Marvell's guest room, and she thought about Roy pouring concrete in 1974 section by section in the evenings after his regular job, with the trouble lamp hung from the barn floor above him, and the Missouri summer heat, and the specific kind of tiredness that comes from physical work done over many consecutive days. She thought about what it meant to build something for someone you loved, to think ahead in that particular way, past your own need for rest, past the inconvenience of the process, past the question of whether it would ever actually be needed. To do it anyway because the person you loved might someday need it, and you wanted them to have it. Roy had not known about Hell's Angels or Holt Greer or the 5 days. He had not known about Danny's letter or Ned Calloway or the tin box buried in debris for a Saturday morning. He had not known about any of it. He had known about the tornado that came through in 1967 and what it had done to the properties to the south. He had known about the Missouri sky and the specific color it turned before the worst storms. He had known about Nora, which was to say he had known everything that mattered. He had poured the concrete, She closed her eyes. She slept. Sunday passed in the ordinary way of Sundays at Marvel's house, which involved church in the morning and a large midday meal, and the particular Sunday afternoon quality of time that moves differently than weekday time, slower and more lateral, without the forward pressure of things that need to be done. Nora did not go to church. She stayed in the guest room and read from Marvel's hallway bookshelf and drank coffee and thought about Monday. She called the insurance company's after-hours line on Sunday evening and left a message saying that she had not reached a decision and would be calling first thing Monday morning. She did not sleep that night with the ease of the previous night. The difference was not anxiety exactly. It was the quality of waiting that is not passive, but attentive, the kind of waiting that has somewhere specific to resolve. Monday morning, Marvel drove her back to Hollister. They left at 7:30, which put them in Hollister with time to spare before 9 o'clock. The drive was 60 miles on roads that had been partially cleared, but still bore the evidence of what the storm had done. Debris along the shoulders, broken tree branches stacked in front of properties, the occasional structure still wearing blue tarpaulins on damaged roofs. Marvell drove and was quiet, which was one of the things Nora appreciated most about her sister. The capacity for quiet in moments that did not require filling. They turned onto Route 76 at 8:45. Royce Bundren's rental car was already parked at the edge of what used to be Nora's driveway. He was standing beside it in his dark suit with his briefcase, consulting his phone. He looked up when Marvell's car pulled in, and his expression arranged itself into its professional configuration, simultaneously sympathetic and procedural. Nora got out of the car. She stood on the road and looked at the cleared foundation of her house, and beside it the two heavy steel doors of Roy's cellar, still closed, still intact as they had been since last Wednesday morning, when she and Holt had emerged into the gray dawn and found everything changed. Royce Bundren walked toward her with the measured pace of a man approaching a conversation he has had many times and knows how to manage. He said, "Mrs. Callum, I am glad you could meet me this morning." She said, "Mr. Bundren." He said, "Have you had the chance to consider our settlement offer?" She said, "I have." He opened his mouth to continue. That was when she heard them. It was not loud yet. It was at the threshold of hearing a low vibration that could have been mistaken for distant thunder, except that the sky was clear, the blue of a clean October Monday with good visibility in all directions. It was the sound of engines. Many engines. Very many engines coming from the west along Route 76. Growing with the steady certainty of something that has been moving toward this point for a considerable distance and is arriving now at its destination. Royce Bundren heard it too. He turned toward the sound. They came around the bend in Route 76 with the measured pace of a procession that knows where it is going and is not in any hurry because the distance is done and the arrival is what matters now. The first bikes appeared, and then more behind them, and then more behind those, filling both lanes of the road, the sound of them building from something felt in the chest to something that occupied the air completely. 300 motorcycles. Royce Bundren stood at the edge of Nora's driveway and watched them come, and his face went through several stages of reaction that he was not entirely managing successfully. Nora watched too. She watched them fill the road in both directions. She watched them stop. She watched the engines cut one at a time, and then in groups until the sound diminished, and then ceased entirely. and what was left was the October morning air and the sound of the wind and 300 men standing beside their motorcycles on Route 76 outside Hollister, Missouri, looking at one woman standing at the edge of her foundation in a blue cardigan. Holt Greer walked forward from the front of the column. He stopped beside Nora and he looked at Royce Bundren. He held out his hand and said, "I would like to see the settlement offer, please." Royce Bundren looked at him. He looked at the 300 men behind him. He looked at the two vehicles that had arrived with the motorcycles' pickup trucks, loaded with lumber that was still visible beneath its tarps. And he looked at the third vehicle, which was a news van from a Springfield television station, whose reporter was already out and setting up a camera at a respectful distance. He looked back at Holt. He opened his briefcase and produced the settlement form. Holt took it. Standing beside him close enough that she could see the document was a man she had not met, maybe 50, with the particular economy of movement of someone who has been efficient with his time for a long time. Holt said his name was Ardell, that Ardell had ridden with Hell's Angels for 11 years, and that before he had ridden with Hell's Angels, he had practiced real estate and insurance law in Missouri for 19 years. Ardell read the document. He read it thoroughly in the way of someone who reads documents of this kind for accuracy rather than impression. When he was done, he looked at Royce Bundren with an expression of professional neutrality that contained at its edges something less neutral. He said the Section 14 adjustment applied here is not supportable under Missouri Statute 379.140, which limits depreciation calculations in total loss scenarios resulting from declared natural disasters. Taney County was declared a federal disaster area on Thursday. He paused. Additionally, this settlement was offered before the federal declaration, which means the calculation predates the relevant legal context entirely. He looked at Royce Bundren. "You can accept a formal objection this morning, or we can file with the Missouri Department of Insurance and Consumer Affairs today. I would note that KDQT is setting up a camera approximately 40 yards to your left." Royce Bundren looked at the camera. He looked at his settlement form. He looked at 300 men standing in the road. He put the form back in his briefcase. He said, "We will be in touch, Mrs. Callum." He cleared his throat. "Our office will review the calculation in light of the disaster declaration." He walked to his rental car and got in and drove away. Holt watched him go. Then he turned to Nora. She said, "I did not know you had a lawyer." He said, "Ardell has been riding with us for 11 years. Before that, he was in law for 19. He does not advertise it much." She said, 11 years of riding and 19 years of law. Holt said, he says the bike is more honest than the law. She looked at the 300 men filling the road. She said, "Holt." He said, "Nora." She said, "Danny asked you to show up." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are showing up." He said, "We are 16 years late." He looked at her steadily. "We are going to make up for the time." She looked at the foundation of Roy's house, at the cleared concrete of the cellar doors, at the lumber in the trucks, at the 300 men who had ridden from wherever they had ridden from to be standing on Route 76 in Hollister, Missouri on a Monday morning because a young man named Danny Callum had written a letter in March of 2007 and asked them to. She said Roy built that cellar so I would always have somewhere safe to go. She said it mostly to herself. The way you say things that have been in your head long enough to need to be said aloud to verify they are still true. Holt said, "And now we are going to build you something to put above it." She looked at him. She put out her hand. He shook it. Then he turned to the 300 men behind him, and he raised his hand once, a single clear gesture. And the organized motion of them beginning their work was something that Nora would think about for the rest of her life. The way a thing that has been held in suspension finally moves, not gradually, but all at once. 300 men with a purpose and the tools to accomplish it. Beginning in the same moment, the sound of them changing from the sound of waiting to the sound of work. Marvell appeared at Nora's side. She had been standing by her car through all of it, and she stood there now with the expression of someone who has watched something happen that she will be describing to people for the rest of her life. She said Ellie. It was the name she had called Nora since they were children. She had not called her that in years. Nora said, "I know." Marvell said, "Danny." Nora said yes. They stood together at the edge of Roy's foundation and watched 300 men begin to build. They worked the way people work when they have decided that something will be done and the only variable remaining is when. The lumber came off the trucks in the first hour, organized by type and dimension, with the efficiency of people who had done this before, or who had prepared carefully enough that the doing felt like something they had done before. Generators were unloaded and positioned. Power tools emerged from cases and bags. A man who introduced himself to no one in particular simply walked the foundation perimeter 3 times with a measuring tape and a notebook, making calculations. And when he was done, he began directing the placement of the first structural elements with the quiet authority of someone whose competence does not require announcement. His name was Fergus. He had been a licensed contractor in Missouri for 22 years before he started riding with the Hells Angels chapter out of Columbia. And he had built or renovated 41 structures in that time. And the number 42 was now beginning to take shape on Roy Callum's concrete floor in Hollister. Nora watched from the road for the first hour. Marvel stood beside her, and between them, they said very little because what was happening in front of them was not something that commentary improved. By mid-morning, the frame had begun to rise. The first vertical members went up from the sill plates with the particular sound of new lumber being brought under tension. A sound that has a clean quality to it. The sound of things being assembled rather than demolished. The October sky was clear and very blue above the rising frame, and the light was the specific October light that has a lower angle than summer, and therefore makes shadows longer and more distinct. And the whole scene had the quality of something that was happening at exactly the right time of year for the light to do it justice. Nora eventually stopped watching from the road and went to sit in a folding chair that someone had set up for her near the cellar doors, which put her close enough to observe everything, and far enough from the active construction that she was not in the way of it. Someone brought her coffee. She did not see who. The coffee was in a paper cup, and it was very hot, and she held it in both hands and drank it slowly and watched the walls of her new house begin to define themselves against the Missouri sky. Cutter found her at 11 in the morning. She recognized him from the cellar, from the specific way he was carrying himself, slightly favoring the left side, and from the splint she had fashioned for his arm, which was still in place, though it had been supplemented by a proper fiberglass cast that someone had seen to in the intervening days. He sat down on the ground beside her folding chair, without asking if it was acceptable in the way of someone who has decided that formality is not the right register for the current situation. He said the arm is doing better. She said, is the swelling down? He said mostly. The doctor said the splint you put on it in the dark during the tornado was better than what most people would have done in a hospital. She said I had 30 years of practice, and I had a good kid. He said Holt told us about Danny, about Ghost. She said yes. He said I never rode with him. He was before my time in the chapter, but I have heard his name my whole time with Hell's Angels. She looked at him. He said, when you are a prospect, the older brothers tell you about the people who define what the chapter is. Ghost is one of those names. He paused. They talk about how he was the first one to show up for anything. It didn't matter what it was. Somebody needed something. Ghost was already there. Nora looked at the rising frame of her house. She said he got that from his father. Cutter looked at the construction. He said the guy said to tell you that Fergus has built houses in 3 weeks before. We have more people here than he has ever had on a build. He thinks we can finish the structure in 3 days. Mechanical and finishing will take a few more. She said that is remarkable. He said, Fergus says the remarkable thing is having enough people who know what they are doing. He says most builds are slow because you spend half your time waiting on one crew before another can start. He has every crew here at once. She said, how long have you been riding with Hell's Angels? He said 6 years. Since I was 24. She said, and before that. He said nothing worth describing. He paused. Hell's Angels is where I became a person worth describing. She looked at him. He was 30 years old, sitting on the ground beside her chair, with a cast on his arm that she had started in the dark during a tornado. And he said that sentence without drama or self-consciousness, as a simple statement of something he had decided was true. She said, Danny said something like that in one of his letters. He said the chapter was where he found out who he actually was. Cutter said, yeah. He paused. Yeah, that is about right. They sat together for a while without talking, watching Fergus direct the placement of the roof trusses with the particular satisfaction of someone watching work being done correctly. The day moved through its hours with the concentrated quality of days that contain a great deal of activity and very little wasted motion. By late afternoon, the walls were sheathed and the roof trusses were in place, and Fergus was walking the structure with his notebook, making notes with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose calculations have proven accurate. The news van from Springfield had been there for most of the day. The reporter, a young woman who moved with the professional ease of someone accustomed to being in places where things were happening, had filmed the construction and interviewed several of the riders and had asked Nora at one point in the early afternoon whether she would be willing to speak on camera. Nora had said, what would you like me to say? The reporter had said, whatever you would like people to know. Nora had looked at the camera for a moment and then at the construction behind it, and then back at the camera. She had said, my husband built a storm cellar in 1974 because he wanted me to always have somewhere safe to go. Last Wednesday, that cellar held 79 men through an EF4 tornado. These men are here because of a letter my son wrote in 2007, before he went back to Iraq for the last time. He asked them to look after me. She had paused. My son knew who he was asking. He knew what kind of men they were. He trusted them with the most important thing he had, which was his mother. She had looked at the construction again. I think he was right to trust them. The clip was on the regional news that evening, and had been shared enough times by the following morning that Nora's phone, which she checked with the systematic infrequency of someone who uses a phone as a tool rather than a companion, showed notification counts. She had to scroll to read. She did not read them. What she read on the second night sitting in Marvel's car, which Marvel had driven back to Hollister and parked at the edge of the property so that Nora could be present without being underfoot, was the rest of Danny's letters. She had the ones from his deployments in a small bundle in her wallet, kept there for years, and she read them in order by the light of Marvel's car dome, sitting in the passenger seat, while the construction lights that someone had rigged on the site illuminated the rising structure and the men working on it against the dark Missouri night. Danny had written well. He had always written well, which she attributed to Roy, who had read to him every night of his childhood from whatever was available, novels and history, and the occasional encyclopedia volume when the novels ran out, so that Danny had grown up with the rhythm of good prose in his ear and had reproduced it naturally when he put pen to paper. His letters from Iraq talked about heat and waiting and the specific quality of friendship that develops between people who are in difficult places together. They talked about the men in his unit with the careful affection of someone who understood that caring about people in dangerous situations was a specific emotional skill that had to be managed correctly. They talked about home in the way that people talk about places they are not sure they will see again, with a vividness and attention to detail that suggested they were being preserved rather than simply described. One letter said, "Mom, I keep thinking about the cellar. I keep thinking about Dad pouring that floor one section at a time after his regular job. I've been thinking about what that means, the kind of person who does that. Who thinks that far ahead about what someone he loves will need? I want to be that kind of person. I am working on it." She read that letter twice. Then she folded it and put it back in its place and sat in the dark car, listening to the sounds of construction from the site which had continued through the night. Under the work lights, the sounds of a building being assembled around a concrete floor that had been waiting for something to be built above it for a week. On the second morning, the Owens family from 3 farms over arrived with a truck. Carl Owens was 64 and had farmed the property adjacent to the Callum land for 30 years. He and Roy had argued about a fence line in 1997 and had not resolved the argument to either of their satisfactions, and afterward had settled into the comfortable coexistence of neighboring men who have decided that the fence line is less important than the fact of being neighbors. His wife Doris made a kind of cornbread that Nora had eaten enough times to have strong opinions about, and she arrived with 4 pans of it in the truck. Carl stood at the edge of the construction and watched it for a while. Then he found Fergus and asked what needed doing. Fergus told him. Carl went and did it without further discussion. This became a pattern on the second and third days. People from Hollister and from the surrounding county came to the site in 1s and 2s and asked what needed doing and were told and did it. The feed store owner brought pipe fittings that were needed and stayed to help install them. The woman who ran the diner on County Road F arrived at noon on the second day with enough food for 50 people and said nothing about it, and left the containers and drove away. 2 men who had been at the emergency shelter at the high school gymnasium since the tornado, who had lost their own property in the same storm, showed up on the morning of the third day with their tools and worked for 8 hours. and would not discuss it when anyone tried to thank them. The line between the Hells Angels and the community of Hollister, which had been a clear line on the Monday morning when 300 motorcycles had appeared on Route 76, was by the third day no longer a clear line. It had become something more permeable and less defined, the kind of social boundary that dissolves when enough people on both sides of it are holding the same hammer toward the same purpose. Nora observed this process with the attention of someone who has spent 30 years watching how people behave in situations that remove ordinary social filters. Hospitals are like that. Catastrophes are like that. They have in common the removal of the usual set of performances that people give each other in ordinary life. And what remains when the performances are suspended is usually more interesting and more true. On the evening of the third day, Fergus walked the completed structure and made his final notes, and came to find Nora, who was sitting in her folding chair, watching the last of the work lights illuminate what was now unambiguously a house. He said, "She is weather-tight. The mechanical inspections will need to wait for the county inspector, but everything is code compliant." He paused, looking at the structure with the evaluating eye of someone who has made something and is assessing whether it is what he intended. The framing is good. Better than good. She said, "How long did it take you to build your first house?" He said 14 months. He paused. 4 of them were waiting on permits. She said, "And this one." He said 3 days for the structure, another 4 for the finishing. He looked at her. 41 houses in 22 years, and I have never built one this fast. She said Roy built that cellar over 6 evenings. He said your husband was a deliberate man. She said in everything. Fergus looked at the structure again. He said the cellar integration is solid. The connection between the old foundation and the new structure is as strong as anything I have built. He knew what he was doing when he poured that floor. She said yes. He did. On the evening of the third day, with the house weather-tight and the finishing work underway, Holt called the gathering. He did not make a formal announcement. He simply moved through the site and spoke to people, and the people he spoke to moved through the site and spoke to others, and within 30 minutes, the field adjacent to the Callum property was filling with the 300 riders and the Hollister neighbors and the people who had arrived over the 3 days to help all of them moving toward the gathered space in the way of people who understand that something is about to be said that requires them to be present for it. Someone had set up 4 propane fire pits in a rough square, and the light from them was warm and uneven, and moved across the faces of the assembled crowd in the way of firelight, which is to say honestly and without flattery, showing things as they are. Holt stood in the center of the square. He was not a man who performed in front of crowds. He was a man who spoke to them, which is different. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he let the assembled crowd settle into its attention before he began. He said, "Most of you know the basic shape of what happened last Wednesday. A woman opened her shelter to 79 men who had no other option and kept them safe through an EF4 tornado, and then stood in the ruins of her home the next morning and made a joke about the kitchen." Someone in the crowd laughed. It was a genuine laugh. Holt said, "What most of you do not know is everything that came before that night." He paused. There was a young man who rode with our Missouri chapter from 2003 to 2007. His road name was Ghost. His given name was Danny Callum. He was the son of Roy and Nora Callum of this property. He served 2 tours in Iraq. He did not come home from the second one. The gathered crowd was quiet. He said, before Danny went back for his second tour, he did something that I want to tell you about because it is the kind of thing that tells you who a person was, more than anything else you can say about them. He wrote a letter. He addressed it to our chapter president at the time, a man named Ned Calloway, who was a good man and a good president, and who died in 2009 before he could deliver what Danny had asked him to deliver. He paused. He said Danny's letter was in a tin box on a shelf in Nora's bedroom. The tornado took the bedroom. Our brothers found the box in the debris last Saturday morning. He looked across the fire-lit crowd. I want to read you what Danny wrote. He reached into his vest and produced the envelope, which he handled with the careful respect of someone who understands what they are holding. He read it. He read it in full without abbreviation or paraphrase, in the unhurried way of someone who understands that the words were written to be received completely, and that anything less would be a diminishment of them. The gathered crowd of 300 riders and Hollister neighbors, and 2 men who had lost their own homes in the same storm, stood in the firelight and listened to the words of a 29-year-old man who had thought about what his mother would need and had asked the people he trusted most to provide it. When Holt finished reading, there was the particular silence of a large group of people who have been moved and are taking a moment to understand that they have been moved. Then he said, Danny asked us to show up. He said, don't ask her if she needs anything because she will tell you she is fine. He said, just show up and keep showing up. He said she deserves that. He looked at Nora, who was standing at the edge of the firelight. He said, we failed to show up for 16 years. Ned died before he could reach her. The letter stayed in a box. And Nora Callum spent 16 years alone on this farm, not knowing that her son had tried to protect her, even when he was 10,000 miles away, and going back into something he knew was dangerous. He stopped. He said the tornado brought us here, but Danny brought us here. And what I want to say, what I need to say, is that we are not here because of obligation or because of debt. We are here because of who Danny was, and because of who his mother is, and because when a brother asks you to do something, you do it, even if it takes 16 years. Holt reached into his vest. He produced a small square of leather. It was dark brown, well made, with a brass border around the edge and embroidery in white thread. The embroidery showed the Hells Angels chapter insignia, surrounded by a wreath. Below the insignia, in letters that were small and careful and precise, was a single word: Mother. He said in the history of the Hells Angels, this designation has never been given to anyone outside the chapter. It is not a patch. It is not a title. It is a recognition of a specific truth, which is that certain people occupy a role in a community that goes beyond what they were asked to do or what could have been expected of them. He looked at Nora. By unanimous vote of every chapter represented here tonight, we are recognizing Nora Callum as the mother of the Hells Angels Missouri chapter. Not honorary, not ceremonial, real. He walked to where Nora was standing. He held the leather square out to her with both hands. She took it. She looked at it for a long moment. The firelight moved across the surface of the embroidery. She looked at the word in its careful letters, and she thought about Danny writing his letter in March of 2007. And she thought about Roy pouring concrete in 1974. And she thought about what it meant to be held by people you did not know you had. She looked up at Holt. She said, "I have been alone since 2007. He said, "I know." She said, "That is a long time to be alone." He said, "Yes." He paused. "You are not alone now." She pressed the leather square against her chest. She did not cry. Not at that moment. What she felt was something that was not exactly grief and not exactly gratitude and not exactly relief, but contained elements of all three. The specific compound emotion of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told that other hands will take some of the weight. Holt put his arms around her. She accepted it the way she had accepted Marvell's embrace on the morning after the tornado, with the practical patience of someone who understands that the people who care about you need to express it, and that receiving expression with grace is its own form of generosity. But this was different from Marvel's embrace. This was the embrace of someone who represented 300 other people, and a letter written in March of 2007 and 16 years of absence that was now in this field by these fire pits in the October evening being resolved. She held on. The gathered crowd did not cheer or applaud. They stood in the firelight, and they witnessed which was the right response. And after a moment, without coordination or instruction, the nearest people began to come forward one at a time to say what they needed to say to Nora Callum of Hollister, Missouri. Cutter came with his cast and said, "Thank you for the splint." Ardell, who had been a lawyer for 19 years before he started writing, said that she would be receiving a full and correct settlement from the insurance company within the statutory deadline, and that he would insure it personally. The old man who had recognized Danny from the back of the cellar came and stood in front of her and said that he had ridden with Ghost for 18 months before the second deployment, and that Ghost had talked about this farm every week, and about his mother more than that, and that he was glad to finally be standing on the land he had heard so much about. Carl Owens from the neighboring farm came and stood in front of her, which required him to navigate past several hundred people, and said that he and Roy had argued about a fence line for 20 years, and that he had always been wrong about the fence, and he was sorry it had taken a tornado and 300 bikers to bring him to that conclusion. Nora laughed at that one. It was the laugh that surprised her the same way the kitchen joke had surprised Holt on the morning after the storm. The laugh that arrives because some things are genuinely funny, even in the middle of things that are not funny at all. And it did something to the gathered crowd that she would think about afterward. The way her laughing had given the 300 people standing in that field permission to exhale. The gathering continued for another 2 hours. Food appeared as food always appears when enough people are in one place long enough, from the backs of trucks and from the hands of people who had driven in from Hollister, carrying covered dishes and paper bags. Someone had set up a table near the fire pits, and it accumulated contributions the way such tables do, with the organic randomness of many separate decisions arriving at the same destination. Nora ate and talked and received the people who came to her with the engaged attention of someone who understands that being present for others is itself a form of nourishment. She heard stories about Danny that she had not heard. She heard about a moment in 2005 when Ghost had driven 4 hours in a single night to be with a brother whose father had just died, arriving at 2 in the morning without announcement, sitting in the kitchen until dawn, leaving before anyone else was awake. She heard about the way he could fix any engine that anyone brought him, with the same unhurried competence that Roy had brought to radios. She heard about his laugh, and about his particular way of communicating disagreement, which was through an extended silence that was unmistakably an opinion, without being a confrontation. She heard herself in those stories. She heard Roy. She heard 68 years of Callum family operating principle being described by people who had experienced it through Danny without knowing where it came from. She said to the old man who had ridden with Danny he was very like his father. The old man said he talked about his father all the time. He said his father had built something on this land that would outlast everything else, and that when things got hard, he thought about that, and it helped. She said, Roy said that when he finished the Cellar, he said that no matter what happened, I would always have somewhere safe to go. The old man said Danny quoted that. He quoted it to us more than once. She sat with that. Her son had carried his father's words across 2 tours in Iraq and through the years of his membership in Hell's Angels, and had quoted them to the men beside him when things were hard. Roy's words, poured into the ground in 1974, had traveled further than Roy had ever traveled, and had done work that Roy could not have imagined when he set down his trowel and went inside for iced tea. On the Saturday morning the house was finished. Fergus did his final walkthrough with the county inspector, who had been contacted on Wednesday, and who had made the drive from the county seat on Saturday with the expression of a man who has been told something improbable and has come to see whether the improbable has actually occurred. It had. The inspector walked every room with Fergus and made his notes, and at the end of the inspection, he signed his paperwork and shook Fergus's hand and said that in 23 years of inspections, he had not seen a structure go from foundation to finished in a week. Fergus said it helps to have 300 people who know what they are doing. The inspector said it would need more than that for most projects. Fergus said it helps to have 300 people who have a reason. The house was a craftsman style which had been Fergus's recommendation and Nora's agreement when he had asked her on the first morning what she wanted. It had a wide front porch with the kind of floor joists that do not flex under weight, which Fergus said was the mark of a porch that was meant to be used rather than looked at. It had 3 bedrooms, which was 2 more than Nora needed, and which Holt said was the point. It had a kitchen with a stove that was level on all 4 burners, and which Nora tested 3 times before she was satisfied. It had windows in Danny's room that opened with a single turn of the latch smooth, and requiring no technique. On the front of the house above the door was a sign. It had been made by a man in the Hells Angels Columbia chapter who had come on Monday and who worked as a woodcarver, and who had spent the 3 nights of the construction on his own project, producing something that was not on Fergus's plans, and that everyone else had either not known about or had kept quiet about. The sign was carved from a single piece of white oak, 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall. It showed 2 hands, one larger and one smaller, both open and facing upward, and between them a stylized representation of a farmhouse. Below the image, carved in letters that were precise and deeply cut and meant to read clearly from the road, were the words, "Where the Callums built, they built to last." Nora stood in front of the house on the Saturday morning with Marvell beside her, and Holt on her other side, and she looked at the sign for a long time. She said, "That is not what I expected." Holt said, "Fergus said you would probably say that. He said to tell you that the house is built to the same specifications as Roy's cellar in terms of structural integrity. He said Fergus wanted you to know that. She said Roy would have wanted to inspect the framing. Holt said Fergus saved documentation for you. Full material specifications and framing diagrams. He said Roy sounds like the kind of man who would want to review them. She said he is exactly that kind of man. Was." He paused. "Both." She walked up the porch steps. The boards did not flex. She put her hand on the front door and felt the solidity of it, the specific quality of a door that is set correctly in a well-built frame. She opened it and stepped inside. The smell of new wood was everywhere, clean and sharp. The smell of a structure that has not yet had time to accumulate the layered quality of a lived-in place. It would, she thought. It would gather that quality the way houses do, incrementally and invisibly, one morning and one evening at a time. In the kitchen on the counter was a small tin box with the letters CF on the lid. It had been cleaned and the minor dents from the debris had been worked out as much as they could be, and it sat on the new counter in the new kitchen, as if it belonged there, which it did, which it always had. Inside it, placed carefully back in the envelope, was Danny's letter. She picked up the box and held it. She stood in her new kitchen with the tin box her husband had bought in 1968 in her hands, and through the kitchen window she could see the front yard, where 80-odd people were still assembled in the October morning, and beyond them Route 76. And beyond that, the flat Missouri fields that the storm had passed over. And through without apology, Holt appeared in the kitchen doorway. He said, "There is something else outside." She followed him out, in the yard, to the side of the house, in the area between the house and the old barn's remaining wall. Someone had dug 79 holes in a rough grid pattern, each one prepared and waiting. Beside the holes were 79 rose plants in their nursery containers. She looked at them, then at Holt. He said, "One for each of the brothers you sheltered. The variety is called Carefree Spirit. It is a climbing rose which Ardell looked up and says is particularly suited to Missouri winters. It will come back every spring." He paused. "It will need tending, but it is designed to survive without a great deal of intervention." She looked at the 79 prepared holes and the 79 roses waiting to be placed in them. She said Roy kept roses along the east side of the house. "I have tried to maintain them every year since he died." She stopped. "The tornado took them. He said these are not replacements. They are something different." She said, "I know." To the right of the rose grid set in the ground on a small square of fresh concrete was a stone. It was a modest stone, dark granite, shaped simply with a smooth face for the inscription. The inscription read, "Danny Callum. Called Ghost. Son, soldier brother. He asked us to show up." She walked to the stone and crouched beside it. She put her hand on the smooth face of it. The granite was cold in the October morning and very solid and completely still. She said, not to anyone present, not to Holt, who was standing behind her, or to the assembled crowd in the yard, "I know, Danny. I know you tried to look after me. That is exactly who you were." She straightened up. She looked at the sign above the door of her new house. and at the 79 rose plants waiting in their containers, and at the stone with Danny's name on it, and at the 300 people in her yard, and at the fields beyond the road, and at the October sky that was clear and blue and very high. She said to Holt, "I have one question." He said yes. She said, "How do we plant 79 roses before the ground gets too cold?" He said, "We have 79 people who know which end of a rose bush goes in the ground." She said then we should get started. That afternoon in the yard beside the new house, 79 roses were planted in 79 prepared holes by the people whose arrival they represented, each person placing their rose with the careful attention of someone who understands that what they are doing is both practical and not only practical. The work took most of the afternoon and involved a great deal of coordination and some debate about the appropriate depth of the holes, and at least one moment of genuine comedy when Cutter, attempting to plant his rose one-handed due to the cast, was assisted by Carl Owens in a collaboration that neither of them had anticipated, and both of them seemed to find acceptable. By late afternoon, when the light had moved to the angle that Nora associated with the end of productive days, 79 rose plants stood in the Missouri earth of the Callum farm in a grid that was not quite regular, but was clearly intentional, like something that had been planned by people rather than arranged by accident. Nora walked the grid, slowly stopping at each plant, touching the soil around the base of each one, assessing the depth and the firmness of the setting. She had grown roses for 40 years. She knew what she was looking for. What she found plant by plant was that they had been put in correctly, all 79 of them, with the care of people who had been told that this mattered and had taken that instruction seriously. She came back to the stone. She stood beside it with the late afternoon light on her face and the October wind in the yard, and all around her the evidence of a week that had taken her kitchen and her porch and the elm tree and had returned something she did not have words for yet, something that she would spend the following months finding language for in the particular way of things that arrive before you have prepared to receive them. Holt stood beside her. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Sunday dinners." She looked at him. He said Danny's letter said to show up and keep showing up. We intend to keep showing up. He paused. Whoever is in the area on a Sunday will come. We will bring the food. You will provide the property and the company. She said, "That is an extraordinary commitment." He said, "Danny made an extraordinary ask." He paused. "We are going to honor it." She looked at the yard. She thought about what Sunday dinners would mean. The yard filling with people. The porch being used. The kitchen accumulating the smells and sounds of regular occupation. The gradual addition of the layered quality that houses gather from being lived in and shared. She said Roy would have built a bigger table. Holt said Fergus already measured the dining room with that in mind. She turned to look at the house, at the wide porch, at the sign above the door, at the kitchen window through which she could see the counter where Roy's tin box sat. She said all right. He said all right. The sun was moving toward the horizon. In another hour, the October evening would be complete, and the first stars would appear over Hollister, Missouri. The same stars that had been above Roy's property for all the decades that Roy's property had existed, indifferent to what happened beneath them, but present regardless. The assembled crowd began the gradual process of departure that large gatherings go through, which is never sudden, but always eventual. The fire pits were tended down. Tools were loaded into trucks. Machines were covered and secured. Conversations that had started in the afternoon found their conclusions, or were designated as continuations of some future occasion. Nora stood on her new porch and watched people leave. She shook hands and accepted embraces and received the particular quality of farewell that people give when they intend to come back, which is different from the farewell that people give when they are not certain they will. Cutter was among the last to go. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her with his cast across his chest. He said, for what it is worth, Danny talked about this porch, the old one. He said his mother sat on it in the evenings, and that it was the most peaceful thing he could picture when he needed something peaceful. She said, I sat on it every evening for 40 years. He said, I think you will again. She said, I intend to. He nodded. He went to his bike. The last engine started and idled and found the road and its sound diminished down Route 76 until it was gone. Then the sound of it was gone entirely, and what was left was the specific silence of an October evening in Missouri, which is not an empty silence, but a full one containing wind and distance and the particular quality of a place that has been genuinely inhabited for a long time. Marvell came to stand beside Nora on the porch. They stood there together in the way they had stood together outside the cemetery in October of 2007. And before that, outside the hospital where their mother had died in 1989. And before that, in the yard of their childhood home on a summer evening long enough ago that neither of them could have said precisely when it had been. Marvell said, Are you going to be all right here? Alone? Nora said, I am not alone. Marvell said, I know. But in terms of the practical day-to-day, Nora said, Marvell. Roy built that cellar so I would always have somewhere safe to go. Danny asked 300 men to look after me. The insurance company is going to pay what it owes. The house is built. The roses are planted. She put her hand on the porch railing. It did not flex. She said, I am going to sit on this porch every evening. I am going to tend those roses in the spring. I am going to read Danny's letter every morning and wind Roy's watch every evening. I'm going to make coffee at 6 o'clock and leave it on the burner the way I always have. And on Sundays, this yard is going to be full of people. She looked out at the Missouri evening. She said, I have been alone since 2007. She paused. That is done now. Marvell looked at her sister on the new porch of the new house on the land that the tornado had passed over. And that was still as it had always been the Callum farm. She said Danny knew. Nora said he did. He knew exactly who he was asking and exactly what he was asking them to do. She paused. That is what I want you to understand about him. Not that he died. Not that he was brave, though he was. What I want you to understand is that when he thought about what mattered most to him, he thought about making sure I was taken care of. And then he did something about it. He was Roy's son in that. Roy always did something about it. The last of the light was going from the western sky. The temperature was dropping the way October temperatures drop in Missouri when the sun leaves quickly and without ceremony. Inside the house, the lights were on the new electrical, and the light came through the kitchen window and through the front windows. and lay across the porch in rectangles. Nora looked at the light on the porch boards. She said I should go in. She said there is a kitchen in there that is level on all 4 burners. She paused. I have things to cook. She opened the front door of her house. She went inside. The door closed behind her. On the new porch of the Callum farm, the October evening continued its business, which was the business of evening everywhere, the dimming of the light, the arrival of the cold, the first stars becoming visible in the east above the flat Missouri horizon. The yard was quiet. The 79 roses stood in their grid in the still air. The stone with Danny's name caught the last of the western light on its smooth face and held it for a moment, and then let it go. On the road, Route 76 was empty in both directions, but it would not be empty on Sunday. It would not be empty on the Sunday after that. Danny Callum had asked his brothers to show up. They had come.